So our first speaker today is Clare Shanklyn. Really pleased that she could join us today. Clare's worked in a variety of different data roles in charities and in the not-for-profit sector, ranging from data management, analysis and strategy. She's recently joined the Art Fund, where she's the head of data there and leads a small team to create a new data function at Art Fund and implement their data strategy. And before this, she was the data strategy lead at Prostate Cancer UK. Just really pleased to have Clare here today. I know that she's very passionate about working with organizations to improve how they use data and has a lot of practical experience of creating and implementing data strategies. So I can't wait to hear what you have to share with us today. So I will pass over to you.
Hi everyone. So I'm Clare Shanklyn, and I'm here to share with you today some things I've learned along the way about building data strategies, developing them, and implementing them. And I don't think I've got like a foolproof approach, but hopefully there's some practical stuff in there that might be useful for people, particularly if you're just starting on it now. So I'm suggesting kind of a it's not necessarily a 6-stage waterfall approach to building a data strategy, but essentially to ensure that everything's covered. I think you definitely you definitely need to start with gathering.
Sorry, Claire. Yep. Just to make sure, could everyone mute?
So in terms of a 6-point approach, it's really about making sure you get the information to start with, particularly if you're coming into an organization and you don't know anything about it to start with your company. So for example, my last role, I went into Prostate Cancer UK. I was brand new into the role to really approach the data strategy from scratch. It obviously will be different if you already work in an organization. So you also need to kind of analyze where the organization is, what the environment is. For example, in the pandemic, it was very different. The first year of the pandemic was very different for a lot of organizations. There wasn't necessarily any money to do things. So we had to think about kind of different ways of doing things, different ways of doing what we needed to do in line with strategic priorities. And then planning and prioritizing, communicating and delivering, these are all how I'm suggesting you kind of work with a strategy once you've designed it. So from my own experience, I'm going to just give you just a bit of background on the kind of 3 different types of strategies that I worked on. So in the first example, I had a full-time BAU role as head of data, and I was within fundraising. I didn't report into SMT, and I was very much focused on my BAU role, but it was something I needed to do alongside that. The organisation didn't have any additional resource for this initiative, and we were in the middle of a CRM program, so very much all of the focus was on that. So it was I guess not an ideal circumstance to be doing a data strategy in. And because I was the head of data, I've been at the organisation for some time, I had a really detailed understanding of the organisation and data systems. There wasn't necessarily a big learning curve there, but essentially I think that can be both good and bad, really, because I was kind of pretty invested in it as well. So the second example, I went into an organisation. It was a pure data strategy role, so I had no responsibility for any data operations, reporting, anything like that at all. So I could really focus on the role, which is one of the reasons I was really attracted to it, actually. There were, given the environment at the time, there were limited additional resources available. So I was able to, for example, do an organisational data maturity assessment, which I'd really recommend doing. And because I was completely new to the organisation, to develop the strategy, I had a really steep learning curve in that organisation.
You're talking to me. Too much pasta. Oh, sorry.
And the third example is the organisation I've just joined, the Art Fund, and again, it's a new role. but it's both to deliver the data strategy and to develop a new data function in parallel. So BAU is sort of happening at the same time, but in this example, the organisation before I joined, they did a data strategy with a consultancy called Quantis, and they basically delivered a high-level data strategy in collaboration with Art Fund, and that's what I've got to work with when I've come into the organisation, which again is a slightly different situation, but in this situation there's a lot of engagement, and I think it's because of the sort of intensive work they did on data strategy before I started. And here, as I said, I'm in really early stages, but there is an understanding that we will need additional resource. Obviously, I'm not necessarily going to get everything that I need, but this is certainly an example where we will be able to get different resources as we need them. So I think I'm just making this point here really because I think where you are in this these examples, and these are obviously only some examples of where somebody might be doing a data strategy, and you might not be someone who works in data at all, and you might be tasked to do with it. I think that's I've definitely seen that happen before as well. But it will really depend how much time you spend on each part of the approach, because obviously you need to spend more time gathering information if you don't know, and talking to stakeholders if you don't know anything about it, the organisation before you come in. But also that having a fresh pair of eyes can also be quite effective as well. So in terms of gathering information, you need to start with the organisational strategy and priorities, I would suggest. Data strategy isn't something standalone. You really need it to help you to deliver what the organisation wants to do, and you need to present it to the organisation in that way, I think, because otherwise it can look like you just want to use a lot of resource to do something for its own sake, which is obviously not what you're trying to do at all. So again, going back to the previous slide, where the organisation is, that I think it's quite important in terms of where the organisation is in terms of like the appetite for change, and also whether they're going through a lot of other types of changes in the organisation as well, because I think that all does affect your ability to really get the engagement that you need for data strategy. So in terms of praising the current situation, you need to have, I don't think, particularly if you're coming into the organisation for the first time, I don't think you need to know every detail about how data moves around the organisation, but you need to have a sense of where your data sets are, what the kind of governance is around them, how you're moving data between systems, whether it's consolidated, being manually aligned, whether it's fully integrated, for example, and all of those things will help you prioritize. And you also, I think at this point, it's also helpful to look at how people within the organization use data and insights. You know, are they using data to make decisions? How effective is that? Are they using, you know, and also data skills and capability are really important at this point, because often you can find that organizations have quite a lot of new tools, but there's not necessarily the kind of the skill set within the organization to really use them to their greatest advantage. So so that's all a really key point to look at as well. And in terms of engaging and consulting with stakeholders, it's really important. I think particularly if you go into an organization for the first time, you really need to find out what people's issues are, and it might be they have quite a good understanding of what their issues are. It's just that they haven't either had the resource or the time to actually deal with them. So I think that part of it, if you're new, needs to be done quite a sensitive way, because you're going to need engagement from people across the organisation. So it's really important to collaborate with them from the beginning. And this is the point where the data maturity assessment is really important, which I'm going to cover in a minute. And I think it's also important to document findings. So it will help you kind of communicate, I think, of where you are now and what you want to do next. And a lot of the times things like kind of, if you have known data quality issues, they are very much in people's heads, and it's not that you may find that actually even just documenting these things and trying to link up different parts of the organisation with what challenges they're experiencing can be really effective. And the data maturity assessment results are obviously a really key part of this. So in terms of assessing data maturity, this is a really good starting point, because you can find out where your organisation is in the kind of charity sector compared to other charities or the non-profit sector generally, but also you then have a benchmark for if you ever run the assessment again, which I think is a really good way of showing ongoing achievement and impact with a data maturity assessment in 2 or 3 years' time after you've done the first one. It will help you identify your priority areas for improvement, so you know where the real challenges are, and also where your strengths are, which can be a helpful way of talking to the organisation about what needs to be improved, but what's actually going quite well. So you gain an understanding of where the organisation kind of is on data, how they feel about it as well, and what would make things better for people. And it's a really effective engagement tool to start getting everyone talking and thinking about data. So sorry, just go back to that one. So I used in actually all 3 of these circumstances, we've used the Data Orchard data maturity assessment tool, and there are different types of tool depending on what organisation you have and what resource you have available. There's like a free taster tool. There's a free assessment where you can do it as a group of people. And the sort of gold-plated version is the organisational assessment, where everybody in your organisation can fill in the data maturity assessment and you get whole organisation results. You can break them down by team and department, and you can also add some of your own questions. So if resources allow, I would really recommend doing that, because it just gives you so much more. And I think particularly if you're a data person doing that, you get the raw data and you can really get underneath it. Which again, if you then do a repeat assessment, it's really helpful. So, but it also, I think the really important thing here is it gives you a way of talking to the organisation about, with authority, about what the kind of challenges are within the organisation and what needs to be done next to address, for example, skills development or analysis tools, etc. So I think it's important to look at this point of where the organisation is and what you're likely to be able to do, so you can set realistic priorities. So just gave you an example of the organisation I've just joined. People are very ready for a data strategy, and they're all kind of ready engaged before I arrived, which is a really good situation to be in. Obviously, I have to maintain that enthusiasm and people's ability to spend business resource on these projects, and really we're going to need a lot of internal resource from business teams to work on projects, but that's really important. But I think this is an important stage to really figure out whether what you're doing is realistic and what you can do to make progress when perhaps you can't address all aspects to start with. So I think this is really important for helping you prioritize. So in terms of the priorities in the first 6 months, I think it is important to show, whereas I would recommend a balance of don't overpromise and underdeliver, be realistic in what you can actually do. I think people do need to see sort of tangible progress. So for you as an individual or group of people to gain an understanding of what the data landscape is, assess your data maturity, and identify any risks to work you're doing, any opportunities potentially, and any quick wins. And I think quick win is used is often used in these kind of situations, and I'm not convinced there are that many quick wins, because generally a lot of these problems have been built up over time, and it's due to kind of underlying issues that need to be addressed. You need to put things like governance in place, and I don't really see those as quick wins, but potentially there might be some stuff that you can do very quickly to deal with people's issues and help them help them see the benefit of the sort of data strategy work. So it's really important to engage lots of different types of stakeholders. You obviously want the people who are responsible for business areas and processes, data specialists, but also senior managers, so you can get the resource and the investment that you need. And I think at this point, encouraging everyone to contribute and feeling like it's kind of an open forum for people to collaborate on what needs to be done first and how we can approach it. I think it's quite difficult to do something as one person. So establishing a working group of some description, it doesn't need to be really formal, but that can be helpful depending on the type of organization. And it's really key that people's roles are clear. So having an SMT sponsor is really important, I think, because you've got that one person that can really help you get your point across, get you access to the people you need to have access to. It means when you're working on cross-organizational projects as part of the data strategy, you've already got a group of people that you can go to and say, this is what I'm thinking of doing, and they're a sounding board, but they're also holding you accountable for what you said you're going to do. And I think it's really important to share what you're going to do, what you're planning to do, when it's going to be done, and how the benefits are going to be measured and communicated to the organisation. And yeah, so sort of ongoing communication of the strategy throughout. So sharing what you're doing and what you think success will look like, raising awareness of what the benefits are, and really maintaining two-way communication with stakeholders so people know what's actually happening and how the different things you're working on, because some data projects may be very kind of in the background. You may be putting things in place like information asset registers, data governance. It might not be that clear to the organization that these things are really important and you need to put that infrastructure in place. So this is a way of making sure you definitely communicate with everyone. So I've just put some examples in here of what kind of products might be useful at this point. So I think with data strategy, it's really important to have some kind of quick elevator pitch of this is what this data strategy is going to do for the organization, because potentially some people within the organization won't want to know that much more about it, but I think at least you have that kind of basic understanding, and it helps build knowledge as you kind of go through the strategy. I think it's important to have some kind of diagram or visualization of the strategy. So for example, at Prostate Cancer UK, I had a data foundation stage, and it showed what was happening in that stage. Then I had kind of master data management, all of the activities around bringing our data together, which we could do after we'd done the foundation stage. And then the next stage was innovation, which really helped describe why we had to do this foundation work first, before we could get to the next two stages. But again, I think that helps people understand it. A high level presentation with key points is also really important, particularly if you're dealing with really senior people that don't have time to potentially read loads of documents in detail. And I think in terms of the data strategy itself, I think there's probably differing views on this, but I personally find it helpful to have a data strategy document with the detail behind the kind of high level points, and have that for reference and to share it with people who want to see it, but not necessarily just rely on that. So it's also useful to have an executive summary at this point. So in terms of delivering the project, I think it's important to have, rather than a kind of a big bang approach to, if you've identified, for example, 10 data foundation projects you want to deliver them in an agile way so people can see what's there, you can really work on user expectations for those projects, and you can flex them as you need to changing business requirements. And once you've got your data strategy in place, then evaluating, embedding it is also really important. So how are you evaluating progress? Do you want to do a second data maturity assessment? You need to give people an opportunity to kind of feedback on what's happened so far, and then use that to develop your strategic projects for years 2 and 3, and your alignment with any other strategies, any other change work that's happening in the organization at the time, and also to plan for any transition to BAU if you've been using kind of fixed term resources or anything like that. So just a really quick recap. I think it's really important to get engagement from the beginning, to be very clear on internal resource implications. That's definitely a mistake I've made in the past. I didn't really communicate well enough how much time I was going to need from people. So that's something I think is really important, to have realistic timelines around the things you're going to do, so you don't overpromise and underdeliver. And I think incremental change can be a lot more effective in maintaining engagement, because this is a long journey. It's not going to happen too quickly. So I think that's more important than a kind of big bang of we've fixed everything and here you go. Cool. So that's everything from me. I think we're having questions at the end, so I will pass back to Dulcie. Thank you, and sorry about the tech problems at the beginning. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Claire. That was great. And there's been loads of questions already in the chat. I think from my perspective, it was just wonderful to see such a sort of clear outline of a path that one could actually follow, because yeah, just having that sort of template is great. We're going to take some questions at the end for those of you who joined partway through. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat or keep them, and we'll try to answer as many as we can towards the end. I am now very pleased to welcome Tom French. I'm just going to pull up my notes on on Tom. So Tom,
don't build me up too much.
Oh, I'm going to.
Oh, okay.
So Tom is a bit of a jack of all trades, and he has decades of experience now working with and for charities, for different voluntary groups and social enterprises, both on the ground, but then also as a researcher and analyst and evaluator. Tom is based up in Sheffield and is a freelancer now, supporting nonprofit and public sector organizations with simple practical steps that they can take towards using data and evaluation better, with the goal that they can then tell their story clearly and evidence impact. We are friends with Tom in part because, many reasons, but in part because he founded and coordinates the Sheffield Data for Good group, which is a group of volunteers working together to understand some of the city's challenges. Yeah, and I'm just really grateful to have Tom here to tell us about his experience working with social sector organizations in building data strategies. So over to you, Tom.
Thanks, Dulcie. I'm going to share my screen as well. I've got a few slides. Just as a starting point, I just want to manage expectations. Giselle mentioned this hat. Where is it? This hat behind me. It doesn't feature, so I apologise for that. It's just background. She seemed excited that I might put it on. So I'm just going to share my screen. 1 second. So hopefully you can see a title slide. If somebody could just give me a verbal confirmation, that'd be great.
Yeah, all good.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about my experience in different guises, I guess. I've reframed the question slightly to say how to build an inclusive data strategy, because that's something important to me about how we include people across an organization. But most of the work I do is not necessarily about developing the strategy per se, but it's more about the starting to think about one within different types of organizations, and I'll mention a few examples as we go through. So a bit about me. My background is I studied maths way back when, but then I ended up more in the voluntary sector on the ground doing sort of community development work, and then later moved into the charities sector, and then applying the maths and that element to that sector, and recognizing actually there was a real need to think about how data in its broadest sense was used. So before I went freelance, I was leading on the data strategy at an organization in Sheffield called Good Things Foundation, and that sat within a research and design team as it was then. As a freelancer then, so I'm sort of 3 years into this journey as a freelancer, working with a variety of organizations. Some are really small and local organizations, some are national, but really just getting to grips with ways people use data to describe what they do, identify needs, all that kind of stuff. So a couple of current projects that are relevant to this conversation, working with Aptelligen as a lead partner, looking at some data strategy stuff for Trussell Trust at the moment, and also working with Voluntary Action in Sheffield on some data strategy work, which I'll reference in some slides here. I really want to point out that I'm still learning. I don't feel like I'm an expert in this stuff. I kind of ended up doing data strategy stuff a bit by accident, but I really now do it. It's my bread and butter stuff. So I'm still learning things. The things I'm saying today are not meant to be prescriptive or the perfect way of doing them. They're just sort of observations, I guess, from things I've been doing. And my approach to data strategy really is based on supporting people to think about the questions they want to answer as an organization, and how you can bring everyone within an organization on that journey of trying to think about how you might begin to answer those questions, and importantly, what you would do as a consequence of that. And we'll talk about that. And this conversation today really is, like I say, just a sort of a few examples from my experience. So why have a data strategy? I guess that was one of the questions that was part of this session. And a few of these examples are, I'm sure you've heard all of them before. So thinking about the questions you want to answer, how you direct, influence, and develop your work. So that might be understanding a particular need or opportunity that you want to focus on. It might be about getting reactive feedback stuff from people you work with to understand how you might shift your delivery, whatever that looks like. And it might be also about getting data to support funding applications and all that kind of stuff. And I think the last two for me are the things I feel strongly about, that it's really important to have a shared understanding within an organization of what things you're collecting, why you're collecting them, who's responsible for them, but also who benefits from that, and thinking about that kind of thing as well. And the last point there about the thinking about power imbalances sounds like a bold statement to me, but I do think there's something about, I've been in positions, certainly within charities, where a CEO comes to you and says, I need this figure by yesterday. What is it? Can you give it to me? And I think those power imbalances, what I mean by that is, by having ad hoc requests for information and not having a centralized approach where everyone's on board with it, means that you actually pull resource away from doing sort of more developmental work that makes it consistent across the board. And externally, I think the sector more broadly, we're often at the behest of funders' requests for data and that kind of stuff to report back for a given funding pot or that kind of thing. So I think it's important to think about data strategy in that context as well, and how we can start to claim ownership of the data we've got and have more meaningful conversations about those dynamics as well. So it's important for me to include that in. So framing data strategy, and this section is really just some thoughts I've got about some of the tensions that exist with data strategy, some of the people that you need to give data to or receive data from, that kind of stuff, but also just in terms of that big question about what we actually mean by data. So for me, and this might be contentious in sort of data science circles, but I think data in this context and the way I'm talking about it in this presentation is all the things you've got at your fingertips or want to have at your fingertips that help inform what you do. So sometimes that will be technical data. It might be a database, depending on the size of organization you are, that kind of thing. But it might also be case studies, videos, feedback forms, all of that kind of stuff. So I'm talking about data holistically here, but I think, you know, in definitions of data, people talk about the data becoming information and knowledge and all that kind of stuff. So I think there'll be purists out there, so I apologize to them. But yeah, that's just to cover off what I think I'm talking about. Interestingly, I think I've learned over time that the process of developing a data strategy is actually putting in place. So for me, I don't feel like there's a development stage and then there's a thing that you've got that you then put in place. I feel like the two things are sort of one and the same. anything you can do to start the conversation about questions, answering them, what data you're going to use to answer those questions is implementing a data strategy, as long as you bring people along with you on that journey, I suppose. And again, just reiterating that point that it's an ongoing process, not necessarily documents will be involved, but I like to take an approach of encouraging sort of multiple outputs that serve different purposes. And that, again, really want to stress that there is no one size fits all for this, and there's no definite way of doing it. One of the other tensions that goes on is that we've spoken about. Perhaps this is the origin of some of the power dynamics internally, that you can have some operational stuff, whether it's financial data, reporting to funders, all that kind of stuff, versus strategic data, which I sort of perceive as the things that management might want to take to a partnership conversation or be speaking about in certain roundtable situations or lobbying policy decisions, that kind of stuff. So there is a bit of a tension there, purely because I think there's practical constraints at the operational level, depending on the size of organisation, versus the expectation of what an organisation wants to, how an organisation wants to present itself at that strategic level. And I think there's also a tension there between core activities as an organisation, what are the bread and butter things, versus the influx of things you need to measure for a specific project. And again, that's about power dynamics with the funders that we mentioned earlier. Another tension is the kind of how much of your data strategy is about the technical elements, like the things that make people's backs go up when you mention data, like people sometimes feel that they don't have the expertise in the data bit. And there's, I'm not going to talk much about systems in this chat. It's more actually about the cultural thing, how you bring people on the journey, start to feel comfortable with having this conversation about data. So central to my approach, at least, when thinking about data strategy, is really to think about starting with questions, thinking about starting to answer them, not finding the answer, I don't think, but also thinking about what is the relevance to the strategy of the organisation overall, and importantly, what is the thing you're going to do should you get an answer to that question. And often I just say, if you don't know the answer to what you're going to do with it, then don't bother collecting it. I also think data strategy is a way to really sort of figure out what the responsibilities are within an organization when it comes to data. Some of the work I've been doing recently has sort of highlighted that people absorb data responsibilities sort of informally across organizations, and the go-to person for figure A, B, or C, or whatever that you want to say. And sometimes that's sort of not documented. It means there are bottlenecks in places, all that kind of stuff. So I think data strategy is really about thinking about that as well, and confidence as an organization to know what the truth is within that organization, where to go and find the things, and for people across the organization to feel confident to say that as a sort of endorsed view of what the organization is doing. And for me, a data strategy is not about being totally prescriptive, but can you find a way of having a consistent approach centrally so that you can have flexible things to produce on the back of it. That might be a report, it might be a paper to go to a partner that you want to influence, it might be a dashboard, it might be a visualization, it might be whatever, but somehow trying to figure out what the central way of doing things is. So you've got that flexibility. I don't know how well this diagram is going to show up, but I will be sharing these slides afterwards. But what this is meant to show is that I've kind of centralized a strategy in this green box here, but it's to show that there's many things to kind of consider with a data strategy. First and foremost is just that kind of changing societal context, I guess, and all of those things that are slightly outside of your control, but inherent to what you do as a charity, because you want to understand what your purpose is, what your need is, and how you might describe that. And then we've got things like you might have a membership base or a network, but if you don't, you certainly have people interacting with what you do? How are you going to think about getting relevant data from them in a way that is proportionate and fair, and considers ethical considerations and some of the governance things that were mentioned earlier. Then down in this bottom right hand corner, we're really talking about what are the staff capacity there, and the operational stuff, but also how does that work with internal governance and strategy? How can you marry all this stuff together? And then at the top, we kind of make note of those strategic partnerships, and what their priorities are. How can you both inform those and get data to inform what you want to do, and also funders and supporters as well. So I'll share these slides afterwards, but I think that's quite an important thing to start thinking about. And the reason the strategy is in the middle is it helps to sort of make you frame it in those terms rather than as an organization, I suppose. So I just wanted to show a couple of examples of things that I tend to do when having conversations with organizations about data strategy. It's not all I do, and it's certainly not, there's plenty of other things that you could be doing too, but these are the things that I find particularly useful in having conversations. One is to really do quite a bit of work that's might be you might call it theory of change, you might call it logic models, but really just to hammer out what people across an organization think they are doing, what they're putting in place, what the context is, what change they're creating as a result. And the reason being, I'm just going to show the example of the data collective, if I may. And again, you won't be able to see this diagram particularly neatly. And this isn't a technical thing. This is just kind of asking questions about what we're trying to do here. And the idea is that this left-hand side is about the context within which the data collective operates. So things like people working with data in the social sector feel isolated and need to be connected. Some inputs here, and then these are the activities that they do, some of which is identifying and creating open spaces for connection, which I guess this event falls into. And then there's leading to positive change for organizations involved, and then sustained impact. The reason I think doing this exercise is useful for a data strategy is each one of these blobs or squares is a thing to start asking questions about. Does it happen? To what extent does it happen? And then any kind of connections between things are where you can start to ask questions about how did this input bring about this change. And I think it just is quite a useful or neat way to start thinking about data strategy. Something else I like to do is really start building up a question bank with people, and mapping those to strategic and priority project priorities and objectives. So just to show you this is going to a tool called Airtable, which I could talk about for hours, but obviously we haven't got it. So this is some work I'm doing with Voluntary Action Sheffield. They have this question here, and they were able to start linking it back to elements of their logic model, like they think they are building and supporting a strong membership base. Okay, we've got a question about that. They're saying it's an internal question as opposed to an external one. And then again, coming back to that important thing about what you're going to do with the answer, they've sort of documented that. So I think these are useful activities too. I also believe strongly in a principles approach to developing things. So here's an example from Good Things Foundation, and there's loads of other good examples out there, but it's just really open headline things. What are we trying to do with our data? How are we going to approach this strategy and that kind of thing, because it does help to sort of give a guiding steer, I suppose. Something else that was mentioned earlier really is just to get a sense of what an organization has got, who uses what, how do they access it, how do they perceive that it's, whether it's accessible, all that kind of stuff. And that second question about how people feel about data and why, I think is really, really important. I think that will highlight a lot of things about skills, but it'll also just highlight sort of internal cultural things that are stopping people doing what they want and finding the information they need to be able to make a decision or do something differently, or submit an application, whatever it might be. So just to whistle through a couple of tools that might be useful, and again, you'll have the links to this. Some of you may be familiar with Airtable. There are a couple of free templates that I've put together and available out there. One is to support you kind of thinking about the questions you might ask and how you map that across particular strategic things. It looks a bit like this, got some dummy data in it, so don't get too hung up on its sparsity. But like, it enables you to put what your priorities are in as an organization and then map questions against different things. So feel free to use that, and the link will be in the slide itself. But also there's a similar thing for development tool for logic models, but I'm slightly wary of time, so I'll skip through that for a second thing. I'm a big believer in presenting visual things to people, so I use a lot of Google drawings, particularly for the logic model side of things, and things like Jamboards to collate input for whole staff teams. We'll come on to that in a second a bit more. I also feel like something that can happen quite quickly is really just getting a sense of what the questions are people have, and using surveys and forms with set questions that ask people what the question is, when they need an answer, why it is they're asking, what they're going to do with it, gets people in the mindset of thinking about that proactive activity on the back of collecting data. And it's always worth reading blogs. For example, I've been following Dan Barrett quite closely recently and his work at Citizens Advice, as much because it's really transparent and open and honest about the kind of challenges of this stuff, and how you need to wrangle with lots of different things. So I highly recommend just doing a bit of a search, because even people who you might perceive as experts out there are just still struggling with the same things that most people are. And again, some experience from working with the Trussell Trust recently is how can you use existing infrastructure there to really promote the data strategy and get it under people's noses and thinking about different approaches. So finally then, just a few observations. Take people on the journey with you. I think that's a really important thing. Data is not a siloed thing. It's not about a particular team. It's about everybody having a sense of how they can contribute to an organizational mission and aim and all that kind of stuff. So everyone's part of that process. And I think I've learned that you just have to keep banging on about it, talk about it constantly. Weekly if needs be, it does start to filter in, but it takes time. The other thing I think is just try things out quickly. You don't have to get to a point where you've got a set approach and then you find out it doesn't work. And you can use small projects as testing grounds for collecting things and finding out methods that work, how that fits into strategy, how people respond to the outputs, that kind of thing. It is hard, it will be messy, and it takes a long time, and it doesn't end. I think going back to that diagram from earlier with the changing societal context, assume that this is just an ongoing iterative process where you adapt to things that are going on around. And again, this was mentioned earlier, that collecting something that gives you an answer to a particular question is a starting point. There's always going to be other questions you could answer. There's always going to be the next technical solution. Just figure out what makes sense to you as an organization. It might be getting paper forms into a spreadsheet as a first step. That's very different to starting to think about artificial intelligence. And I think that's where the conversation in data within charities has got another tension, is really trying to figure out those levels. And that's where data maturity comes in. Beware of silos within your teams and assumed expertise. I think, you know, in large organizations, particularly when you've got a digital team, they'll adopt a lot of the technical stuff. A research team might adopt a lot of the what things are we going to collect to show about impact, that kind of thing. I think beware of those things, because an approach that works across an organization needs to sort of break out those silos. I also believe in showing things rather than asking people what they want. I think I'd learned that data as an abstract concept to some people is it's a hard thing to get buy-in for an endorsement. Whereas if you show people I've sketched a dashboard, if you could have that, would that work? Getting buy-in that way is a good way to sort of shape a data strategy as well. And the last thing there about not saying data is it's just a provocation more than a recommendation. And that's it from me.
Thank you so much, Tom. Again, just some great kind of tools and practical tips, as well as a kind of high level thinking as well around approaching data strategy. That's brilliant.